Today's date is July 23, 1998. We're interviewing Tina Strobos, rescuer. Maiden name is Tina Buchter. My name is Ed Lessing. We're interviewing in Larchmont in the United States of America. The language will be English. Would you please introduce yourself and spell your first and last name?
My name is Tina Strobos, Tinastrobos.
And what was your name at birth?
Buchter, Buchter.
Did you have any other names?
No, yes. My married name is Chudson, Chudson.
When were you born?
May 19th, 1920.
How old are you today?
I'm 78.
And where were you born, and would you spell that, please?
Amsterdam, Amsterdam.
And what country was that?
Holland.
Okay. Thank you. Tina, I would like to go. I hope you don't mind me calling you Tina.
Of course not.
We have conversed a lot about Holland. We're both from Holland, and I become kind of familiar. I hope it's all right, rather than calling you Mrs. Strobos, which is kind of formal. Would you please tell a little bit about your youth, your early childhood days? Who did you live with, and where?
I lived in Amsterdam the first 2 years of my life. I was born in my grandparents' home op de Nieuwe Zijds voor Burgwal, 282, where later we lived since I was 6 again, and we hid Jews. My mother and a maid and I lived in that house.
Who else lived with you there? Just you and...
my mother and a maid, and we rented rooms.
This was when you were very, very young?
From age 6 till after the war, 1945.
You said you lived there first some years, and then you left for some years.
I was born there, and then my parents moved to Cologne, Köln, Germany, where my father worked for Remington business machines.
Did you go to school in Germany?
No. I left there at age 5.5 and came back to Amsterdam to this house up the Voorburgwal. And we lived there ever since. And I went to the Montessori school.
Tell me, you had grandparents living near you?
They lived in that house. That was their house, yes.
I see. Did you all live... Could you describe the house?
It was like 4 stories. It was part of a school. It had originally been one of the homes and offices of the burgomaster of Amsterdam, the time that they had more than one burgomaster. And then it was divided and it became a school, the Prinsenschool, and the head of the school, principal, lived in the school. And that part of the school, my grandfather rented. He also had a cork factory right next door for a while.
Did you ever visit your grandfather's factory?
Yes, yes.
What do you remember?
Later the factory moved to the Beursstraat, next to the Berlage Beurs.
And what did they manufacture there?
Cork. Cork manufacturing.
Oh, I see.
You know, bottles.
Now, when did you start to go to school in Amsterdam?
5.5, 6, yeah.
And again, what school did you go to?
A Montessori school, and it was a private school, and I went to the first Montessori lycée in Amsterdam, which Maria Montessori was very interested in and visited often. And her granddaughter went to that school, was one of my best friends. And Maria Montessori celebrated her 70th birthday in the school with us. Big party.
What sort of a person was your mother?
My mother was a bit of an adventurer. And she went at 17, that was during World War I, she went to the United States, and she had been sort of self-taught in evening school. She became a secretary in New York. And then her brother Juriaan Schotte, came over too. Had been given money to buy cork cutting machines, but he couldn't get it, and he bought himself a motorbike with a side car, and my mother and he traveled all through the United States to San Francisco. And they arrived in San Francisco on November 11th, 1918, when the peace broke out, and everybody dancing in the streets. From there, she went to Indonesia, where she met my father in 1918. And for the honeymoon, they went to Japan. And my father was the only one who could get back on a freighter because they wouldn't take women, and she had to wait 6 months there.
Go back to where?
To Indonesia, where he had a job in one of the cork factories of my grandfather, Schotten. So, and my mother used that time to buy a lot of Japanese things, kimonos, Japanese wreaths, paintings, woodcuts.
When she was all by herself in Japan?
Yeah, she was there all by herself. I tell the story of how... And she fell in love with a Russian, was the only person that she could talk to. She didn't know Japanese, although she learned some. I can still count in Japanese. And we all believed that that was my real natural father. But I didn't find that out till after I was married. So she was a bit of an adventurer, as you can imagine from this. And she made a lot of money with all the stuff she had bought in Japan from her trousseau.
Why? What did she do
money.
with it?
She started a store in the Kalverstraat in Amsterdam. And she and her sisters sold all this stuff. They also bought some more later. And it was a rage in 1919, 1920. All these Japanese things, kimonos, prints, Japanese prints. They were very fashionable then.
Did your father return to Holland also?
Yes. And then when I was 2, we went to Germany, lived there for a couple of years.
Now, who else lived in the house? You said it was your grandfather.
My grandmother lived there for a while. My grandfather had died in 1924. But my grandmother lived there. But my father, who had built houses in Amsterdam with his brother-in-law, made her live in one of those houses, not with us anymore, which was a great loss for me, because she told me wonderful stories.
What do you remember about your grandmother when she lived with you?
Well, her father died when she was 6, and she had to leave school and go into service. She worked as a maid. And I said, but Grandma, Oma, what could you do when you were only 6? She said, well, you're 6. You're helping me cleaning the green beans. That's what I did. Polish shoes, sweep the floor, polish the silver. I made a quarter a week, and for a quarter I bought a whole mud, it's about 10 kilos, I think, potatoes, and so I could feed my sister and my mother. And my grandma was very proud of that. And I thought as a child, well, if worse comes to worse, I can do that. So I think that was a lesson for me. Also, in the Jordan, it was customary to have a dead person live in the house, be, how do you call that, gebaard in het huis.
Like a wake?
Yeah, like a wake and an open coffin. And she would ring the bell. Imagine at 6, 7. She would ring the bell and say, the man who died, so-and-so, was a friend of mine. Can I see him? And people would say, oh, isn't that nice? Opa was a friend of this little girl. She's so cute, you know. All right. So she was shown. She wanted to see what a dead person was like. And she did that quite a few times, she told me. I was very struck by that. And I think now as a psychiatrist, you know, thinking about that, that she had to conquer her fear of death, that she was very preoccupied with that.
Were you close to your grandmother?
Very close, yeah. And these stories stayed with me, and the things that she did, later she scared as Gestapo who came to interview her. It was very her character.
Staying with your childhood for a
Yes.
minute. You went to the Montessori school, as you said. And how many years were you
From
there?
6 to 18.
I see. So you really stayed on through elementary school, is that
And,
it? And what happened after
and
elementary
the
school?
high school, so-called lyceum, and I took Greek and Latin and science. It's called Gymnasium Beta, if you want to study medicine. Fairly early, I decided I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I read Freud when I was 15, maybe, and I was really impressed. And that's what I wanted to do.
At 15 already, you
Yeah.
knew.
And I think because my father was such a cruel and disturbed person that I had maybe this idea of rescuing people who were mentally ill. He was, I'm sure. I didn't formulate it that way. I just knew
Tell
that
me
he
about-
was very
Tell me about
unhappy.
your father.
He was a very unhappy man who was very critical of me, always criticizing me. And he hit me once in a while. Not a lot. I didn't get beatings, but you don't have to be hit a lot to be frightened. I was terrified of him, terrified. He had eyes that were very light blue with black pupils, and I dreamed of those eyes till I was 30 years old. I would be in a train, let's say, and didn't have a ticket, and the conductor would have those eyes, and I'd be all scared to death again.
Are there any happy memories you have of your father?
Well, he was an art collector, and he gave me a taste for art, and took me to musea. He knew a lot about that. He had a lot of friends who were painters and artists, and as stingy as he was, he did support the artists.
Did
So those are good memories.
Until what age did he stay with you?
He had to build all these houses, and then in the Depression, there were so many, in one whole city block, there would be 70 houses, 70 apartments would be empty, and so they couldn't meet their mortgage payments. And he would yell all the time, "We're going bankrupt, we're going bankrupt." And then he gave the whole thing to my mother, and he went on a ship, a grain ship from Hamburg. It was a training ship for the German Navy, and he had to enlist as crew, and they were incommunicado. They went from Hamburg to Rio de Janeiro, and from Rio across the Cape of Good Hope to Australia to bring grain, and then they'd come back with wool and hides, I guess.
Why did your father do this?
He wanted to get rid of the whole worries of his business. And he gave everything to my mother, who was a realtor. She became a realtor then. And she went to the bank and dressed herself up nicely, and she got the mortgage reduced from 2.5% to 2%. and that saved the business. So
What happened with your father?
when he came back, they didn't get along and they divorced.
How old were you then?
The final parting and divorce was when I was 16. And he threatened suicide if she didn't give him everything back. And she did. And I was angry about that. At 16, I knew that it was wrong. And it was in the presence of his lawyer. And I can't believe that a lawyer would support that kind of blackmail. But she did. So then we had to rent rooms
I see. At
to
that
make
point,
a living.
At that
And
point,
she was a realtor. She made some money that way.
Now, what were you doing as a teenager? What were your hobbies and what?
I played field hockey, basketball, swimming. I graduated from swim school at age 6. And so I swam every day. We're free in Holland from 2 to 4. Go to Zuiderbad and swim. And drippy hair and all, eat my sandwich in the streetcar with some other kids. And then get back into school, all wet still. We didn't want to lose a minute of swimming. So we raced to the streetcar, ate our sandwich, and got back in school.
This was, if I understand right, this was during break in the middle of the day?
Yeah.
And
School, that, is from 9 to 12 and from 2 to 4 every day, even Saturday, right? We went to school, at least till 12. The gymnasium, we went to school at 8:30 to 1 on Saturday. That's how you learn more, I think kids here do. Well, we learned, all of us, if you wanted an education, learned French, German, English, Latin, Greek. I even learned some Hebrew. That was optional.
what sort of friends did you have as a teenager?
Well, Marilena Montessori was one of my best friends.
Who was she?
She was the granddaughter of Maria Montessori, who went to the Montessori Lycée. And I was friends with her all through the Lycée years. Later we were both in the Studentenvereniging from Amsterdam, the
What is
student sorority in Amsterdam.
Did you have any Jewish friends at that time already?
Yes. Truusje van Amerongen, later called Tirza, was my best friend later. From 15, till her death in 87.
Was there, at that time, did you have any particular involvement with Jewish people or Judaism?
Well, Truusje van Amerongen was from an Orthodox Jewish family, but she and her brothers and sisters were rebelling against that, and they became Zionists. And they all asked for visa to what is called Palestine, and they were on a waiting list. And I was very influenced by the Zionists. And one of them, Bram Pais, I was engaged to at 19 till about 22, 23. And we stayed good friends all our lives. We still are.
Was this Bram Pais, was he with you in the Lyceum?
Was he what?
Was he with you in the same school?
No, he was 2 years older. And he was already a student of physics. He became a famous physicist. He's called the father of particle physics.
Where did you meet him?
I met him at this Zionist home of the Van Amerongens op de Plantage Middellaan. And I stayed there a lot. I would say I was there several times a week. And I stayed overnight there. And I stayed in their house in Zandvoort, where they spent the summer. They were wealthy people, and their house was a lot more happy than mine. My mother was very sick during my whole teenage. My father had gone, he was in Africa, Indonesia, and my mother had 8 operations, major operations in that time. So my home was, like a
Do you
sick
know
home.
what was the matter with her?
Yes, she had terrible sciatica, and one of the tumors of her womb was pressing on the sciatic nerve. So that was one of the troubles she had. And each time she went to operation, they would take one of those tumors out, but not until she had a total hysterectomy did she really get well. And she had such horrible bleedings that I remember in the Stad Schouwburg, we used to go to the theater a lot. She bled profusely. We had to take a cab home. And so she was near death a lot of times. She had a heart attack during anesthesia one time, and she was treated for a heart infarct for many years.
How did this affect your mood?
Well, I don't know. I have an ability to be happy like a child, We had dance parties, even in my home. My mother was very good about, say, invite your friends, they can dance here. And we had parties at our houses
And
all through the 30s.
And who would be there at such a dance party, for instance? Who would be invited?
Well, let's say about 20 kids from Montessori school. And we played records, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong. We were all crazy about jazz. And they would come to the Concertgebouw and give big balls. And I've attended those. I was a good dancer. I won a prize once. And I loved dancing, and I still do. So.
What other hobbies did you have besides sports?
Well, dancing. I danced all my life. Since I was in Holland 6, I had dancing classes.
Anything
forgot
else that
that,
you
yeah.
engaged in at that time?
Excuse me?
Any other hobbies or
Theater,
activities?
yeah. I was in every school play. And I played Mary Stuart in Schiller's Stuart in German. In German. And my German accent was still perfect from having lived in Germany as a child. When I came to the United States at age 6, I was put in school the first day we arrived, and I only spoke German and Dutch. And my teacher didn't speak any of those, so if I had to ask her a question, I could go to the principal who spoke Yiddish and German, and I could ask him in German. And so
Tina,
I managed.
you said when I came to the United States,
I was there for about 8 months in the United States, age 6 and 7.
how did this happen?
My father's business, he was an importer of Pyrex and Parker Pen, and that made a big hit too, those two things. So he was a good businessman, and he made good money.
And who went to the United States?
My father, my mother, and I. And my uncle, her brother Evert, an engineer, was already here. We stayed with him for a while too.
Do you have any memories of that time in
Oh,
the United
yes.
States?
Yes. We're going to swim in the Mississippi. No, we're going tomorrow to the Mississippi. And I thought it was a lady, but I was happy to find out it was a beautiful river. They lived in Iowa. And in the school I was in New York City.
And what year did you return to
1927.
1927.
I saw the ticker tape parade for Lindbergh. I have a picture of that. Lindbergh and the ticker tape, and I'm sitting on my uncle's shoulders.
And how old were you then? About
7?
7.
Yeah,
So then you returned to Holland.
to Holland and stayed there.
Yes. Now, what happened after you finished the Montessori school?
We didn't have a valid eindexamen, and so I had to do the university
An eindexamen
eindexamen
being what?
high school was not valid, so from
final
Montessori
exam.
school, Montessori lycée was not recognized. It had just started 2 years before. So I failed the university entrance exams. I was too nervous. I was in The Hague in the Ridderzaal. And I was so...
Which is what?
The Ridderzaal?
Yeah.
Well, where the Queen is inaugurated, you know, and I was scared. I forgot everything. I had always been a very good student. So then I went to the Barlees Gymnasium one year, and I made all 10s there, which is the highest grade, because I knew everything already. And so I had time to do theater, you know.
The Barlees Gymnasium, where was that located?
Op de Weteringschans, close to Stad Schouwburg,
In what city?
Amsterdam, yeah.
So you continued your study at this gymnasium.
And then I did do their exam, which was final exam, which let you into the university. And then I started studying medicine in 1939. I was 19. And the war broke out shortly thereafter. Actually, the Germans had invaded Poland already, September 39.
Did you, at that time, 1939, did you have any inkling of what might come in the coming years to Holland?
Well, in Holland we had this crazy optimism that we won from the Spaniards in the 80-year war by flooding Holland. And so Leiden was freed because the Spanish all got sick from the water. They got typhoid fever. And that's what we were going to do. So the Germans wouldn't dare come in. But, you know, some people knew better, like Churchill. He knew better.
Did any of your friends have any idea about the international politics and what might come?
Well, we were very worried on and off about Germany invading us, too. And he certainly was getting ready for war. That looked evident.
Did you and your friends discuss Germany at
Yeah,
all?
we discussed it. And as I said, the First World War, they had just invaded Belgium. And so we thought that might happen again.
Your grandmother at that time, 1939, was still alive.
Yes.
What sort of
She was
position?
she was 80 then.
She was 80 then.
Yeah.
Tina, I started asking you about your grandmother. Tell me a little bit about her personality and some of her activities.
Well, they were Social Democrats, active in the Social Democratic Party, especially my grandfather. My grandmother had 8 children, so she was busy. In the beginning, they were very poor. They lived in the Jordaan, you know, working class neighborhood. And she took in laundry, even though she had little babies. And one time, they came to tell her, your husband has an affair with Widow Smith. And she took off her wet boezeroen and marched up to that house. And she went up the stairs, and she found them in bed, and she threw this woman naked down the stairs. In the meantime, all the neighborhood had gathered, of course, and they all clapped. And then she came downstairs, and they clapped. And she was a heroine. And I said, but Oma, I said, why weren't you angry at him? Why didn't you throw him down the stairs? She said, I loved him.
Did your
I think that gives you an idea.
Did your grandma actually tell you this story?
Yeah, imagine. She told me this when I was 6 years old.
She told you this when you were
Yeah.
6 years old. Did your grandmother have any political, was she involved in any political activity?
Yes, they were fervent social democrats, and there were a lot of riots and strikes in Amsterdam. It was called the Red City, and there was even once, I remember, it was a big parade, and it was an anti-royalist parade, and it says, 100,000 guilders for a plain old queen. En they just repeated the een doodgewone koningin. And they participated in things like that. And my grandfather was a very smart man, and he read law. He was not a lawyer, he was not self-educated, but he helped people who were arrested. And he would go with them to court to speak up for them. And one time he was arrested himself, and he was in jail when my grandmother still had her second baby on the breast, as she called it. And so they were very active. He also founded, with some others, an atheist society. It's called the Free Thinking Society, the Vrijdenkers.
Who did this?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather.
And they were militant atheists. That's all I heard when I was a young child.
Was this true of your grandmother too?
Yeah.
And what about your mother? What was her religion?
She was an atheist. And my father, who was raised a Catholic and was a choir boy in the church, became an atheist under the influence of the Schotte family because he admired them. They were upward striving. My grandfather started making a lot of money, this cork factory. His oldest son became involved and worked there, and all the women did, but it was, of course, not fashion for women to take leadership roles, so they just were secretaries and things like that. And my mother and father both took classes and learned to speak fluent English, French, German, so that he was all prepared before he went to Germany. He spoke fluent German and French and English.
Your father?
Yeah, and Portuguese later. So he was a talented man, a very well-read, self-educated man. And he took audition studies in economics with my cousin, who later became an economics professor in Leiden. And he wanted to do the same, but they said, you have to do the entrance exams. And he said, well, I'm written books and I don't have to do that. So he refused that, so he never did. Just like him.
Did you ever go to church at all with anyone?
With my Catholic cousins, yes. I liked it. I liked the incense and the ritual. I still like it. I still do.
But did you ever become a
No.
member of a church?
No, I thought about religion, and I read Spinoza when I was 15 with another person from my school, because he proved the existence of God, so he said. Wasn't convincing to me.
Now, we reached 1939,
Yeah,
and you had just entered medical school.
yes,
Is that correct?
yes.
What
And
what
I
happened?
joined, even though I'm not a person really for the student body, because of my, they were more conservative politically. But I did join them thinking, if the Germans invade Holland, we need a body that's anti-German, anti-Nazi, and we need to cling together. And I was right. I could see that was going to happen. And this sorority that I joined was 100% involved in hiding especially Jewish children. And one of my sorority sisters, a Jewish girl who was in medical school with me, Hanni Levy, was actually caught and was in Westerbork. and my sorority got her out of there in a food wagon that was going in and out of Westerbork.
Did you
She was
join?
hiding under the food.
Did you join the sorority immediately after entering medical school?
Not the first year, I think. I'm not so sure about that. I knew it was important to join, but I had a little bit of doubt whether I could make it through the first year. There was so much science. That was not my forte.
Where did you live when you were
With my
attending?
mother op de Nieuwezijdsverburg.
You stayed at home?
Yeah.
Yes.
It was my mother, and we had a live-in maid, and we rented rooms, 1 or 2.
The people whom you rented rooms to, were they known to you? Were they?
Oh yes, one was a French designer who worked for Liberty Stores. She had been a designer for Maggie Roof and famous Parisian houses. And we became very close friends. She was a wonderful person, and we stayed friends with her even when she went back in '39 to Paris. We stayed in touch after the war, too. So most of the people... And then another person who stayed with us was Jan Pen, who was the grandson of friends of my grandparents, and their parents were friends. They made fish nets in the Lemmer, Friesland, and they bought our corks for the fish nets. And Jan Pen studied economics, and he stayed with us a few years. We also had Chinese students. My grandparents already did. Had a Chinese student. It's sort of half, well, they had refugees from World War I in their house.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, and we had refugees from Hitler since 1933. My mother was secretary of the Women's Peace Movement, which was an international movement, and she was secretary of the Dutch branch, and they fought Nazi films and Nazi propaganda. And once when there was an UFA, that was the German filmmakers, when they were showing Youth Zeus on the Rembrandtsplein in the UFA theater, she and her colleagues from the peace movement went to protest it.
This is your mother?
Yes, that was in 1933-34, to fight the Nazi propaganda films. They were terrible movies. And I was then still like 12, 13, and I was standing on the Rembrandtsplein because it was a much heralded protest. And the police on horseback was filling the square, Rembrandtsplein.
You understand it. Your mother took you along to
yeah,
this demonstration?
No, I was not in the movie. She didn't want me to go with her to the movie. But I was watching it from like
outside
public watching.
Yeah.
But she was arrested, and they carried her by her neck close past these horses that were all raising up and whinnying, and she was very scared of the horses. She had been bitten by a horse once, and she wasn't scared of the police, but of the horses.
Did you see your mother being carried away?
Yes, and we all followed her to the police station up at Singel, that's close by the Rembrandtsplein, and she was freed after a few hours. The Dutch did that to appease the Germans. They were afraid to aggravate them and give Hitler a reason to invade. So they were, well, appeasers.
Did your grandmother take part in these
No,
demonstrations?
she
also?
was
She was too old.
in her 70s. She couldn't walk too well. She was pretty fat.
You said both your grandmother and your mother took in refugees.
Yes, my grandparents in World War I from Belgium, refugees, and my mother took in mine workers' children in the Depression from the Ruhr and the Rhineland. They were out of work and hungry.
How did they? These were German mine workers, is that correct?
Yes.
How did they get to Holland?
the German mine workers had a choir, and it was about 100 children in the choir, and the Women's Peace Movement was, of course, asked to shelter them, to house them, and if possible, keep them. So we kept them for a couple of months. We had 2 German children for a couple of months to feed them, fatten them up.
So these were children refugees,
Yeah,
or
during
mine
the
workers?
Depression, 1930. Yeah.
I see.
And then later we had refugees from Hitler.
Tell me about that.
Well, I was a teenager, you know, and as I said, I was dancing and playing in plays and hockeying on Saturdays. So I didn't have too much to do with it, but it was to me a natural thing for my mother to do. That was in the character, that was the family ethos, the family spirit.
But these German refugees,
They told horror stories.
these
you
were
know. They were beaten. They were treated.
did
you
they
know.
live with you?
Hmm?
Did these people live with?
Yeah, they lived with us. They ate with us. They lived with us, and are waiting for visa to Cuba, to Mexico, United States, Argentina.
Did they achieve that? Did they?
Yeah, they never stayed very long, as I remember.
How many refugees do you think you?
I can't
passed
recall
through?
that. I didn't want much to do with it, frankly. I mean, I approved of it, but I didn't really want to be involved. I was working very hard to make it through the gymnasium, you know. So either I was studying or went out a lot. And as I said, my mother was ill a lot too.
Did your mother have the means to give these people food and all that?
I don't know the financial arrangements exactly. I suppose, as later with the onderduikers, the people who were in hiding, if they had money, they had to pay for their food. And if they couldn't, and I don't know if the peace movement supported that. I know that German children didn't pay anything, of course. Yeah.
Looking back on that whole childhood, and who influenced you most in your family?
My mother and my grandmother. That it was our duty to help people.
All right, so we arrive at, as you mentioned before, the war broke out.
Yeah.
What do you remember of that?
I remember waking sort of from the Stukas flying low overhead and thinking to myself, I don't really want to believe this. And then the telephone rang. It was like 5:30, 6 o'clock, and my aunt, my mother's sister, called and she said, "Don't be upset, but the war has started." Yeah. I like that sentence. And we laughed. Well, they were bombing Rotterdam, a bomb field on Amsterdam. They were shooting people who drove cars in the street. You could hear that from our house.
Could you tell me the date that this took place?
May 5th, 1940. And the war lasted 5 days, and we had no anti-aircraft guns, but our army shot at them with handguns and downed some planes. They were that low.
Did you see any activities in
Yes,
yourself?
we saw the Stukas flying overhead.
The Stukas being
Yeah.
airplanes?
And then we listened to the radio, of course, and they said that they would descend in parachutes, dressed maybe in Dutch uniforms or even nuns' uniforms, and to be careful, and if you heard something on the roof, to call such and such. And we did hear something on the roof. And Jan Pen was scared, but his girlfriend and I went on the roof to look, and it was a rat, had loosened a tile. And the tile fell down, so it did make a big impact, but there was none or anything like that.
So, after the Germans invaded Holland, what was the first sign of
So
change?
the second telephone call we had was from Henry Polak, who was a columnist in the Social Democratic newspaper, and he had been a union organizer for the Diamantwerkersbond. He was a famous man and a savant, a very erudite man, and now he was older and he was writing a column weekly or more with his picture in the paper, and he asked my mother if he could hide in her house with his wife.
How did he know you?
Well, he was a friend of my grandfather, and we had helped his cousin. That was one of the people we had in our house for a year, a cousin of his. And so we were in touch with him all through the years. We visited him at his home, he visited us. And
This is Mr. Henry Polak.
So my mother said Henry Polak called and asked if he could hide. And we had a full house at that time, so we called my grandmother if she could have him, and she immediately said yes too. And we said, you just pretend you don't know who he is. But my grandmother said, but I read his column, and I know his picture, and I know very well who he is. Well, you just have to, yeah, but I have all these newspapers in my house. Oh, we'll come right over, and we'll take them away, and then Henry and his wife will come, later in the afternoon. That was the first day of the war. It was the first day after the surrender. We had lost the war. It was this May 10th, I guess. Well, tell me the right date. 8th? May
15.
15. May 15th, we had this call, and so my mother and I went to my grandmother's home and got rid of all the Social Democratische Volkskrant. It was a pink paper. And then she said, but I have all my closets lined with this paper. And so my mother and I took all the pots and pans out and sat there on the kitchen floor ripping out the Volkskrant. And my mother said, Mother, why are you so cheap? Why didn't you buy chest paper, closet paper? And they were stuck on. They were glued on. So they ripped them little by little, And my father got very frustrated because Henry was waiting for us to say he could come in, So,
And
anyway.
if I understand, all this was hanging on.
Yeah, so here we were all laughing, and there was this disaster, hanging over his head, and all our friends, our Jewish friends, as you know, a lot of Jews committed suicide that day. And the Amstel and all the canals were lined with Marxist books, and the Volkskrant, people didn't want them found in their homes.
So what happened with Mr. Polak?
Well, he was sometime in our house and sometime in my grandmother's house, and my Aunt Jans and her husband took care of him also, so and then they didn't do anything the first couple of months. They didn't arrest anybody. And Seyss-Inquart said, if you don't thwart us in our effort to win the war, we're not going to involve you in politics or mess around with you. Schwamm drüber, we sponge all that out, and we won't bother you.
Would you please explain who this
Schwamm
man, Seyss-Inquart, was?
Seyss-Inquart was the head of the Gestapo, but literally he was the head of our government. So he was he was not a military man like in Denmark and Belgium. They had a military governor, and we had this traitor of Germany. He was a friend of Hitler's. He was a fervent anti-Semite and a member of the Gestapo, one of the leaders. And he was a friend of Heydrich and Himmler. And I think this is why the Gestapo was so numerous and so involved later in Holland, even picking up people in the streets who
Let's
looked Jewish to them.
go back to Mr. Polak. So after a while, you said he found out that nothing much was happening.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
and being a man who read and had this huge library and wrote a column, he he missed his home in Laren and his walks on the heath. And he went back and he said, "Oh, I'm an old man, I'm harmless. They're not going to do anything." But they did pick him up later, and he was sick. He became sick in jail. His wife died, but they let him out of jail. And unfortunately, he did not call us back, and he died alone. I first thought that he was saved because his cousin, the other famous Polak, made it through the war. But he has a statue in Amsterdam.
What happened? I'm not quite clear. What happened to him after he came out of jail?
He was just let go. He was very ill, and they just didn't bother. The Gestapo didn't bother him anymore. But he was, I heard he died in 1944.
Now, that was sort of the
And
very
I
beginning.
regret that we didn't help him anymore. But there were so many young people that we helped, children that we hid.
In the very beginning, as you said, nothing much happened.
Yeah.
What was the first sign? Where did you first get involved?
Well, I was involved from that day on with collecting false papers, false identity cards, and get Jews false identity cards without a J on it. And that we did as students all alone. In
Was
40, 41.
that early?
Yeah, and then in February 41, I think, I'm not so good at dates, there was a general strike because all the Jews were fired from, they weren't allowed to practice medicine, they were fired as professors, and I was sitting in a streetcar, and the streetcar from across from us, opposite direction, stopped, and the conductor held up his hands and said, "We're on strike. Oh, everybody get out, we're on strike." The Jews are all fired from the gemeenteraad, from the city council, from the university. We're on strike. And we all got out, and we were all like one family. Stores closed. And this happened on the Verburgwal, so I went home and told my mother, and we told everybody, just close the stores, and we did. They did.
How long did that last?
I don't remember, but I know that the Gestapo arrested 100 Jewish boys in a Jewish neighborhood. And then the Jodenraad, the Jewish council, was formed, and Asser and the chief rabbi and some other people that I know.
Cohen.
Yeah, Cohen and Soup went to the Gestapo, and it was told that he stomped his fist on the desk of the Gestapo. Asher was the uncle of my best friend, so I heard that story, and he said he'd let these Jews go. They haven't done anything, and they did let them go.
You get this straight.
But of course, that was the ruse to give in to the Jodenraad, to establish them as being powerful and having influence on the Gestapo. And then by that act, they became also collaborators. So my Zionist friend would talk to Usher and said, don't collaborate with him, don't collaborate. Well, I can do some good, he said. I can do some good. I got those 100 boys out. But he didn't see that that was very short-sighted.
You said somehow or another you knew this Usher.
Yeah. He was the uncle of my best friend.
I see.
Her mother was an usher. So coming to that house so often, I knew her whole family.
Time went on, and I presume things got worse. So
Yeah.
How did you get involved?
Well,
what
then
happened?
they started, the Jewish Star had to be worn. I don't know all the dates. And I wore a star for a day. But since so many people were arrested doing that, I didn't think that was a very smart gesture to get myself out of commission for just a symbolic gesture. It was, of course, effective, and then some people wore yellow tulips. And I didn't know that any of those were arrested. But I figured that things would get worse, and they were winning the war, so we better lay low and do something effective. So we started hiding people. One of the leaders of the underground hid in our house for a while, Johan Brouwer, and he instructed me what to do when I was arrested. And
What
I
was
didn't. Well, he said you have to try to get some hold and some control over the interview. He said you could say you have a spot on your collar, and actually showed me, you take it, but that I didn't do. That was too scary. What my grandmother did, when the Gestapo came to her house, he said, we arrested your son Jacob. He helped Jews. Your whole family's involved in helping Jews. We have a whole dossier. And she said, you have no proof whatsoever. Did you find any Jews? No. Well, he said, we did have a proof. We have silver with his friend's initials on it, not his initials.
Sorry, Tina, to interrupt you last time when you were telling about your grandmother.
So my
why-
uncle
when-
was
when did
my
this
uncle
happen, by the way?
Jacob was arrested. I think it was by now 43, and he was indeed involved in the underground and helping Jews. But they didn't find any other proof in his house than this silver with the wrong initials. And she took a drawer full of silver out of her chest of drawers.
Who was this?
My grandmother,
Yes.
when the Gestapo came, they'd search her house. They always came with 2 or 6 people. They searched her apartment. She was still living alone by that time, so it was 43, I think. And my uncle was actually in Vught for a whole year,
Vught being what?
a concentration camp in Amsterdam, in Holland. Well, anyway, the Gestapo came, and since they couldn't find anything, he sent all the other guys away, and he said he wanted to interview her, and he had a dossier with him, and he spread it out over the dining table. And she said, you have no proof, and I'll show you why. And she took her drawer with silver, turned it over on the dining room table, and she said, look at this. We buy in auctions. My husband and I did, and my sons and daughters do too. And we have silver, but they have not our initials on it. We don't care about that. And he was quiet, so she felt that she had gained a little ground. Anyway, he made her sit down next to him, and she grabbed him by the upper arm, and she said, and I looked him straight in the eye, and I said, didn't I see you take a Persian rug from the Mendelssohns next door. She had 2 windows next to her door, and she heard commotion and saw men with a flashlight, and they were indeed stealing 2 big Persian rugs. And they and she knew that it was looting and punished. So he quickly got his dossier together and he said he had to go now. And so I don't know many people who scared the Gestapo, but she did. And I said, he could have shot you. She said, well, I'm an old lady, he didn't. Well, anyway, I learned from that one time, I'll tell one story about one arrest. They were looking for a man who had indeed hidden in our house, and his name was Hans de Jong. And he had a factory of lace and nylons, stockings. And the Germans wanted to take that factory over. And they had arrested his bookkeeper, who came regularly to our house to talk about the business, which Hans was still directing from our house, and to bring him money to live. And he was arrested. And we had a feeling that he would talk, that he might be even tortured and would talk, because they were very anxious to take over his factory. And so we emptied out our house. Hans de Jong had to go elsewhere. This was a rule that we were arrested and house searched 9 times, and each time we would be arrested and told we were going to jail and Konzentrationslager if we didn't give information.
Now, when you say we,
My mother and I.
were you both arrested at the same time then?
Often, yes, and thrown in a chair with somebody next to us. And this time, my mother and I were sort of warned that we would get somebody look for Hans de Jong. So my mother went to Leiden to stay with friends. And when they came, I said, my mother isn't home, but I'm taking care of her business in her absence. So he called in the 6 others, and each of the Gestapo took me by the wrist and threw me very hard against the wall, knocking me unconscious for just a second. And I was dazed, and I started trembling from head to toe. And they threw me in a chair and said, you're under arrest because we know Hans de Jong has been in your house. And I said, but he had false papers, and there was no J on the paper. How could we know? He was blonde, he had blue eyes.
In other words, you did not deny.
I said, yes, he was here. We
You did
could
not
not deny, because we knew that this bookkeeper had talked and was a witness. And the reason that I wanted my mother out of the house is that if they would separate us and we would tell different stories, it would be better if they would come back and I would tell my mother everything I had said. Anyway, they interrogated me for a couple of hours, and I was shaking so much. I had been sitting in the sun with shorts on, and now I was shivering. And in order to hide my trembling, I held on to my chair, and I went like this, you know, crossing and uncrossing my legs. And this Gestapo Sachbearbeiter said to me, your legs don't impress me at all. And, you know, I stopped trembling. I gained a slight hold over the interview, and it was an immediate release of my fear. And then, as it went on, it was now 6 o'clock, I said, you know, I was supposed to go have dinner with my grandmother at 6. Do you mind if I call her? So I called my grandmother, and fortunately, Tiert Sa van Amerongen was hiding in our house at that time. People constantly moved, you know, the hiding the hiders were always moving because one house was not safe, and then they had to go somewhere else. Anyway, fortunately, Tirza picked up the phone, and I said, I'm not coming for dinner. They had told me, don't say anything, just I'm not coming for dinner, which was crazy because that's not what you say, right? So I said, I'm not coming for dinner. And Tirza said, but you weren't supposed to come for dinner. Are you having visitors? Yes. She said, I'll call Leiden for your mother not to come. And the man punched down the phone. But I had heard this. So she was very quick. So I was glad because my grandmother was a little deaf and it might not have worked. And whenever I thought of that moment, it was such a relief. Of course, my mother and I had to go to the Gestapo headquarters again about Hans de Jong and hiding Jews and all that. But now we coordinated our stories that, yes, he was in our house, we know his picture, we know him, but we couldn't know he was a Jew. And we really held fast on to that, and they believed us.
Do you really think that they believed this
Yes,
story?
they believed us. They were stupid. And also they said, well, we'll show you. Blonde hair and blue eyes doesn't say anything. The way you have to figure out is we'll show you photos. And they showed us about 16 photos of eye corners, just this corner of the eye, and 16 of them. And they studied as well because that's how you recognize Jews. And we studied it very studiously and he said, when you see that and somebody comes to rent a room in your house, then you have to call us immediately. This is our phone number, and this is the Gestapo headquarters in The Hague. So we, of course, promised to do that. And then when we left there, you know, we were too scared to laugh, but we said to each other, they have gone completely mad. They're all delusional.
Tell me, Tina, all this interrogation that you went through, that time when you were wearing your shorts, where did that take place?
In my house up the Nieuwezijdsverburgwal.
I see. This was
I
not
was
at
just sitting
Gestapo
in the sun
headquarters.
upstairs, and I even had a friend visit, but they let him go because he had no, you know, was not, actually he was in the underground too, but they weren't interested. They were interested at that point to find out where this man was, and they thought that I would confess, see,
Had they
when
searched-
they would throw me against the wall and scare me.
Had they searched the house when
Yes,
they came
from top to bottom for 2-3 hours. Yeah.
in? No.
And they rolled up the rugs. They'd look behind pictures. Once they even bayoneted a closet because they couldn't go all the way in.
Did you have any contact with any organizations
Yes.
at that time?
I wasn't, you know, I didn't get a medal, or now you belong to the landelijk organization. But whenever I had a call, and he said, this is Jan, you're going to have visitors in a few days, maybe tomorrow already. We knew the Gestapo was coming. So he had a list from the Euterpenstraat, which was the Amsterdam headquarters. He had a list of who they were going to house search. And I never knew who this Jan was, but I believed him, and we would empty the house, we looked under all the rugs, get rid of all the underground papers, passports, and so on. And I'd call everybody and says, we're going to have visitors, don't come for a few days. And Hannah Neubauer, who gave us new passports, a Jewish girl who made passports, came anyway. She was very bold. And see, the ground floor was really not occupied. It was sort of a reception room. And then you went upstairs where we lived, and the second floor was bedrooms. And the third floor was an attic with a roof over it. The attic was quite big. That's where we had a hiding place. Anyway, Hannah came, and 2 minutes after she was just walking up the stairs, the Gestapo came. And I said to my mother, I'm going to put Hannah in the hiding place, and you keep them busy here downstairs. That was their habit anyway. They first spread out downstairs, all the closets, then the second floor, then the attic. So I put her in the hiding place in the attic. And fortunately, they didn't stay too long. They stayed about half an hour, and then they left. And I went to get Hannah out of the hiding place, and in front of the hiding place, there was a bunch of freesias she had brought my mother and me with, still wrapped in paper. Now, if they had seen that and they had been smart, they would have said, somebody lost their flowers and it's fresh. There's somebody here hiding, right? Fortunately, they didn't go to the attic. So my mother and I said to Hannah, if we ever call you not to come, please don't come. And another time, well, that was before, it was in 42. A man came with a big satchel or box, toolbox, and he said, I'm a carpenter from the underground to make a hiding place. And my mother said, do you know this man? I said, no, but I trust him because I'm connected. And so he made this wonderful hiding place, and I have trouble finding it when I went back. Because the attic, this house was from 1700, and it'd be remodeled and remodeled. So it was like a Doolhof.
Doolhof being what?
Well, a good hiding place, you know, with all kind of nooks and crannies and closed places. And he actually went outside of the first attic, and the hiding place was actually almost outside of the house. Well, it's hard to explain because it's such a strange building. Anyway, I was thinking of Gaudi when I saw the Gaudi attic, which was all these beautiful. Well, that was beautiful. Our attic wasn't so beautiful, but it was very big, and it had been remodeled. And I hear now it's been made into an apartment.
You mean
No,
now,
this-
1998?
Yeah.
Tina, you and your mother were very involved. What I meant to say, did you have a regular, let's say, were you a regular member of a group?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have regular
Yeah,
contacts?
my sorority would call me, or I would call them. Machteld was the head of it, and I would say, I have a little 3-year-old, and I have to get her out of the ghetto tomorrow, because they're going to raid over there. And do you have a place for her?
Now, you would say this.
I would say
Now,
this.
where
I
did
have
you
a
get this?
little 3-year-old.
Where did you get
That
the
was
information
from our
about the
Jewish connections, our Jewish friends. I knew the family, Melkman,
I see.
Job Melkman and his wife. They called me. We have a hiding place for us, but they can't take a child. Can you take our 3-year-old? So I went to get Tamara on the back of my bike out of the ghetto. She would stay in our house till the hiding place was ready. Then a day or so later, they would say, I will deliver the address in writing today to you, not over the phone. It wouldn't go like that. It would say, I have an address. I'll come over in an hour. And then I would take this little girl on the back of my bike and bring her to that address.
How much of your time during a week would this take up?
A couple of hours a week, I would say, when I was still in school, and almost full-time after 42 when the university was closed. I would bring radio senders around the country, messages. We hid stolen weapons from the Wehrmacht. We had 2 big boxes, as big as that table there, in the hall downstairs. I put a cloth over it. Big help if they came. Fortunately, we were lucky, you know. I wouldn't be sitting here if we hadn't had some luck and some help. And there was a network.
Did you and your mother keep close contact and discuss these things at all?
Well, I wouldn't tell her that I was hiding guns in the downstairs.
You mean your mother didn't know this?
Well, yes, she said, "What is in there?" I said, "It's better if you don't know," you know, that kind of thing.
And
Just pretend you didn't see it. They will be picked up tomorrow, sometimes a little longer than tomorrow.
was there ever a disagreement between you and your mother
Never,
about
never. I felt guilty for years because I felt that I brought all these Jews in the house, but there were as many of her friends in there. Hans de Jong was her friend, and she protected him against my friends because he stole food. You know, we were very hungry all the time, and Hans stole food from the larder, and it was all measured out very carefully, and we wanted to confront him, and my mother said, no, I don't want you to confront him. I'll put it in another place hidden for him in my bedroom, and he can't get it at night. Because we bought that all together, you know, and if hiders could afford it, they had to pay for their food, you know.
When you say we bought this all together, this meant the people who were hidden in your home?
We had 5 people at that time, and 3 of them were Zionists, my student friends. One was Wiesje van Santen, who was just released out of jail. That's a big story. Wiesje van Santen was in a militant group making bombs and, you know, exploding railroads and things like that. And all her friends were shot to death, but she became the mistress of one of the Gestapo, and a young man who was a protege of Himmler. And they dyed her hair blonde, she had blue eyes, and he sent her out to the underground to be a counter-spy. And she went along with this, and she escaped and came to our house. Well, of course, they were looking for her, but they never found her.
Had you known her before the war?
Yes, the von Sandens were friends of my mother. And Wiesje was on the Montessori Lyceum, I think. Yeah, Ina Soep and Wiesje were friends from childhood. And I think she was 4 or 5 years younger. You know how it is in school. You don't really bother with kids 4 years younger. So I know her name, but I know her family, and my mother was friends with her parents.
Tina, you had 5 people hidden in the house.
For the longest time, they rose. Yeah.
What could you describe how they were hidden? I mean,
well, we didn't have to do this whole thing that people in hiding did, you know, hide their beds and all that, because we rented rooms, so-called. So if there was nobody there was just our renters. And we pretended they were businessmen who rented a room but only came, let's say, 2 days a week, because then they had business in Amsterdam and they would travel around the country.
was this the story you would tell the Gestapo?
That's a story my mother and I made up. And for some reason, we were both so, used to be so honest and reliable. They bought our story. They bought it. And we escaped every time. And our story hung together.
But you didn't rent. Let me ask you this. You said at one point your mother rented rooms.
Yes.
During the war, 1942-43, did your mother still rent rooms, or?
Well, Jan Pen was there till 1941. So there was just one guy. But then we started taking in people from the underground, and we didn't rent rooms anymore. Yeah, because that was now our business, and we just asked for whatever they could contribute for food, if they could, but many didn't have any money.
Tina,
And then there was a family that was fairly well off, and we had 3 of their children in our house, but they were restless kids, and they didn't want to stay in the house, and they thought they didn't look Jewish, and they were arrested in the street. They had good papers, but they were arrested in the street. And if they had stayed at home, they wouldn't have been caught. Nobody was caught in our house, ever.
Tina, I'm going to ask you a question. It must have been asked 100 times before, but I must ask it. Why did you and your mother do this?
It was the right thing to do. And you couldn't just... I didn't trust the work camp idea, that they were just working there. And I would say to people, go into hiding, because we never get a postcard from these people. We never have anybody escape from there and tell a story. That is very suspicious. If they worked in a factory, they would find a way to call or leave a note or have somebody contact us. So I feel that they're going to be killed. Or maybe work in a prison factory.
Who are you talking about at this time?
I'm talking now to, let's say, Bram Pijs's sister and her husband. And she said, my husband can't read. He is much too nervous to be going to hiding. And we're young and strong. We'll work in a factory, and the war will be over, and we'll come back. And I said, I don't believe them. I don't believe them. And so I talked to her many times. And she said, I'm going with my husband. And I said, only in Westerbork will you be together. After that, you will not be together. You know they're taking transports from Westerbork to God knows where, Poland, wherever, we don't know. But there are hundreds of concentration camps in Germany and Poland, and you don't hear a word from those people. So, smart people didn't go into hiding and went into these so-called work camps.
So the reason that you got all involved in helping people is, would you repeat it, please?
Well, these people were hunted and, in my opinion, tortured and killed, probably. And it was our duty to help them and hide them. And I wouldn't want to live in a society where nobody cared a damn. And if you were just a bystander and said, well, it's not my fault, it's none of my business, then you were one of these people who didn't care a damn. I didn't want to belong to that group. And my mother neither. And my mother said, you know we can get killed. And I said, well, I would rather be killed than live in a Nazi society.
Did you actually say this?
Yeah, we both agreed on that. We didn't talk a lot about it. When she said yes to the first person who called, Henry Polak, I never said anything. I would have said yes too. And my grandmother we called, she said yes too. Except that we said, well, we can pretend you didn't know them, you know? I mean, we did think of, well, we don't have to offer ourselves up for nothing, you know. If we can get out of it, we will talk ourselves out of it. Then we will be able to help more people, for one thing, you know. You have to think of your own safety, if you can, you know.
Was there ever a time that you had someone, somebody Jewish hidden with you who was really difficult?
Oh, yes.
Did
Yes.
it ever make you think that you didn't want to do this anymore?
No, but I had other hiding places. I would find a place, like for this, Suze de Leeuw was this wonderful little friend of ours, and my mother was friends with the Leeuws. And the Leeuws were living on the Weesper Plain, so they were in the ghetto. And my mother went after a raid to their house, and she called and she said the ghetto was empty and open. And she said, "I'm Marie Schotte. Is there anybody still in the house?" And there came Suze de Leeuw and her husband, because they were not registered in that house. And they hid, and they didn't find them, and they weren't on the list because they were elsewhere. I forgot their residing address. So my mother brought them home, and they stayed in our house. And her husband, Sieg Pekel, was an impossible person.
What was his name?
Sieg Pekel.
How do you spell that?
Siegfried, you know? Pekel, Pekel. We kept much in touch with him. Anyway, Pekel was a horrible person. And he and my mother fought. And he would object, I don't know what, it was all trivial stuff. My mother got very upset, you know. And I said, "Listen, this has got to stop. I'm going to find a place where he doesn't have to deal with people so much." So I found a place for him in the Aalsmeer hot houses. And they would sleep in a hot house, not in a house with people. And it was warm there, and they had food, you know, they grew tomatoes, and that was exchanged for food. So they had food, and they were warm, and they didn't have to deal with the people.
Did this whole couple go there?
So this couple hid all the war in a hot house in Aalsmeer. So that was my solution for impossible people.
Did it ever get to the point where you say, "No, I don't want to help Jews anymore"?
Well, then we sighed from relief that we got rid of Sieg Pekel. And my mother was like a mother to them, of course, because, you know, she had saved them, gotten them out of the ghetto, and she had been a really dear friend to her mother, to Suze's mother, Heintje de Leeuw. She would go there on Friday nights, you know, and be their guest.
Tina, there was a man, Sieg Pekel, who was a pain in the neck, as you tell me. You got rid of him and his wife, and they survived the war.
Yeah.
My next question was really, did it ever lead you to say, well, we don't really want to deal with Jews anymore?
Never. We realized that Jews were like other people, pain in the neck or not, right?
Did you ever hide non-Jews?
Yes, people from the underground. My boss in the underground hid in our house, and he told me things what to do when you were arrested. Always ask for an interpreter. That gives you time to think about the question twice. And you pretend you don't know enough German, so you need it translated. And they would do that. They would do that.
Through the war years, how many people do you think you and your mother helped?
Well, my mother and I made a list with all the names of the people we remembered were hidden. And some people we didn't know the name of. A religious organization of Orthodox Jews called us once and said, "We have a family of 5. Could they hide a few days in your house? We have a place for them, but we need something in Amsterdam for today and tomorrow." And I didn't know those people. I don't remember the name, but we knew there were 2 parents and 3 children. And they would only accept water from us. They had bread with them. And they stayed in one room, and they didn't talk to us. They were afraid of us, maybe because of their religious views, I don't know. But we didn't know them, and so...
Were these Dutch Jews?
I think they were Dutch Jews, yeah. And they wouldn't talk to us. You know, shook hands when they came in, and they said, "Where is our room?" And we had, you know, they had sleeping bags, or we had sleeping bags for the children, and there was a bed for 2 people. and that's where they stayed. And then they would open the door and say, could we get some water? And I would bring them water. Would you like some tea? No, thank you. We're all right. It was a very strange experience.
What other strange? Well, let
And
me get back to your original
they had
question.
to fill in and, locks, and I suppose they were Polish Jews. That's how they looked to me, yeah.
All in all, go back to the original question. Any estimate on how many people passed through your house?
We came up to 100, 98, and then we said, but who were those people? Remember that those 5 people, the Orthodox Jews? No, yeah, okay, so we get over 100, and but some stayed one night, and some stayed a year.
Who financed this?
Well, if they had money, we were straight with them and said we share the cost of the food. And we had a maid who was in the black market, and so food was, through her, a little better than the average, but still expensive too. That's how this bottle of Bols appeared.
You helped, let's say, more than 100 people. Was there ever any religious point to this, a religious reason to do this?
No, it was purely human reasons. Life is sacred, and we have to help each other. That was the reason.
Were you in contact with other rescuers at that time?
Yes. As I said, many of my friends, many of my fellow students were involved in making passports or hiding Jews, or where I was first in a group, this Johan Brouwer, who hid in our house twice, put me in a group of very militant, violent, bomb maker type students, all boys. Gung-ho, they had guns, and I'm a non-violent person, and I didn't really feel... We read Mein Kampf together, that we did. I didn't really want to be involved in their activities. I had enough to do with hiding Jews, and I didn't want to risk my life with violent and what I thought of as not always very well thought out plots,
So how did you get out of this?
They were, how shall I call them? Well, there are people who like to take risks. And I didn't want to take risk for something that I didn't really believe in. For instance, my boss asked me to make 1,000 copies of poems of a poet who was in jail. And they weren't particularly anti-Nazi poems. They were poor poems. He was a terrible poet, and I didn't want to risk my life for that. And I told him so. And he said, "You're a soldier now. You have to obey the law." I said, "Well, you know what I'm doing. I think that's enough. I'm not going to do this foolish thing. And I don't have a printer, and I pick up newspapers and I distribute them, the Parool and the Vaderland and the Geus, and that's enough. I'm not going to risk my life for these awful poems. They're bad poems." So he was mad at me. He said, "Yeah, but this man is in jail, and he used to print poets. Remember, he was a poet, and it's true. In the Telegraaf, he had little poems once in a while."
Telegraaf was what?
Telegraaf was a newspaper. I don't know. Do you remember his name? He was fairly well known, actually. Stupid. Anyway, I didn't do everything. And I got rid of those boys, and I told my boss, I said, "I can't talk to those boys. They're unusual risk takers." And as a matter of fact, they were all killed. And one of my previous boyfriends was killed too, had a radio sender. But there I could see the point, I have a radio sender.
The radio transmitter.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Transmitter, yeah.
You mentioned at some point a Bram Pais. Was he hidden in your home?
Yes, on and off. He was mostly hidden at a close friend of ours close by.
Now, you had a special relationship with him.
I was, you might say, engaged to him, yeah. But we broke up when I was after, 2 years or so. And we stayed very close friends, always. I'm still a very close friend. And the girl he went out with after that was my best friend. And he was a Zionist. He was one of Zionist student leaders. And so I got very involved. And we were at one time thinking we might go to Palestine too.
Is this before the war?
Yeah, that was in '39. Yeah.
And
But he was so dedicated to science, and he became a famous scientist. He has written, well, apart from his scientific publications, he has written the biography of Einstein with the science of Einstein in it. And he has written a biography of Niels Bohr, whom he worked with very closely for several years in Denmark. And then he has written an autobiography. And the first chapter has a lot about the war in it. And he writes about me there.
Was he involved in resistance work?
Well, he did write some poems and pieces for the underground press, but no, he was a scientist. He was the last Jew to get his doctoral thesis printed and heard in the aula in Utrecht, in the university. After that, no Jews entered the university anymore.
Now, he was hidden with you for a while too.
Yes,
And
on his doctoral thesis party, my mother gave a party for him in our house, and we have a picture of that. All these friends were there.
did he survive the war?
Yes, yes. He's professor at Rockefeller University, emeritus now.
Was he ever in danger of
Oh, yes.
not surviving?
He was in danger several times. The house of my friend was raided, and he had a hiding place in the attic, and they didn't find him. But they stayed from 6 o'clock till 12 o'clock at night looking for Jews and stuff that these people had hidden from Jews.
And they never
Silver,
found him, you
gold, jewelry, fur coats. But they didn't find him. But the father of that house was a year in jail for hiding Jewish property. Unfortunately, there were names attached to some of the things he had hidden.
said? So Ben was never caught, actually.
Bram Pais, no.
Bram, sorry.
Bram Pais was never caught.
Was never caught.
And then he was, yes, he was caught, I'm sorry. 2 people in her house, Jeanne van Amerongen, her husband Nordheim, and Tirza van Amerongen, my best friend, managed to rent a house, an apartment op de Stadhouderskade, just in their own name as false papers. And they invited Bram to stay with them. And they were, of course, very pleased. It was in January '45.
He was in hiding then?
He was in hiding. So the men were hidden in the apartment of their Jewish wife and her sister. And the girls went outside and shopped, but they were pleased now they were on their own. They weren't, somebody's guest. And this was somehow betrayed, and they were caught. It was just, the last winter of the war. And I went to high Gestapo official, probably it was Austin Funton, and I said that Bram Pijs was just a scientist, and I had heard, I can't go into the whole story, but I spoke to Sachbearbeiter. I had myself arrested there, and I heard that he didn't have any papers. So happened he had his passport changed, and it was just not there when they were arrested. So they praised him for not having false papers. So I said, you know, he'd never had false papers. He was just a scientist. And Niels Bohr has invited him to come to Denmark. And they did know that name. Bram said that was not Niels Bohr, that was Professor Kramers. Well, maybe so. I don't know. Well, Professor Kramers wrote to Heisenberg about him and asked Heisenberg.
Who's Heisenberg?
Heisenberg was the prominent nuclear physicist of Germany, and Niels Bohr was asked to have an interview with Heisenberg to find out if they were making a bomb in Germany. And Heisenberg was very cautious. He didn't betray anything. Later he said he wouldn't work for Hitler. It would have been impossible to please Hitler. He would always rush him to have something finished when one couldn't.
You said you went to a high Gestapo official?
Yeah, I went to a high Gestapo.
How did you know somebody like that?
I forgot now all the details, but I got his name and address, and I went there, and he was a chic establishment, and there were portraits of him and Himmler and him and Hitler and him and was this fat guy of the Wehrmacht again, Goering, my friend Willy, something like that. And I told him about Bram, and I said, and the women that you got, they are not Jews. Yeah, but they're hiding Jews. And then I said, but Pijs is just a Wissenschaftler. And by this time, it was February, March 45, they knew they had lost the war, and his men knew it. And he called the jail, and he said, "Hast du einen Juden Pijs?" And obviously he said yes, and he said, "Lass ihn gehen." And he was free, and he came to our house. And he said, "I'm the only Jew who walked through the Leidse Straat," and I was free.
Didn't you put yourself into tremendous danger?
Going to the Gestapo?
Gestapo?
I didn't think about that too much. I thought maybe he wants me to sleep with him, romantic. But he didn't. He wasn't interested at all, fortunately. But he let him go. So I went right back, and I said, how about Northeim? He is a famous lawyer, and he called the jail, and he said, "Has an you Northeim?" And he said to me, very bland, he said, "Ist geschossen." Tot. No expression on his face. He was a very close friend of ours. Well, he had a paper in his pocket. We had talked with Van der Kieft and others from the underground press what to do with the Jewish children who survived without parents.
Who had this paper?
Northeim had the manuscript of this paper on him. So he not only slept with a non-Jew, right? I found out, when I was in that house, I found out they said that to each other. They said their woman's clothes and men's clothes in the same drawer in the master bedroom. So this Jew is sleeping with this woman. And he never betrayed Jana, who said she's Jewish. And then he had this paper on him, you know, that he was obviously in touch with the underground press.
And you think this is what
He
caused
was
it?
shot, no.
Of all the times you were arrested, you said several times. Of all the times that you were, what was the most dangerous event ever during those years?
Well, when I went to this apartment where my friends were just arrested, I wanted to find out who the Sachbearbeiter was and what I could do. And I put myself in danger going there, of course. But they let me go after a few hours. And they said, the jails are full, but we'll keep an eye on you. And I thought they just might, so I felt endangered. And that time when they knew Hans de Jong was in our house, and I was all alone, that's why it was so helpful to me to make that telephone call, you know.
Was Hans de Jong a Jew?
Yeah,
Was a Jew
yeah,
also.
of course, yeah.
Yeah. So the time that you went to the ghetto
Yeah.
was the most dangerous? Is that?
To get this little girl?
Yeah.
I don't know.
No.
Probably. Was not safe.
I thought this is what you told me. What was the most frightening?
No, the most frightening was really when they threw me against the wall and knocked me out.
I see.
That was, I didn't know what they were going to do next.
Did you ever decide during the war to stop helping people because it might cost you your life?
No. I never thought about that. And it never occurred to me to betray anyone. It never occurred to me that I could do that. It would, of course, tell you all kind of things, how you would be free if you told them this or that, or you told them where Hans de Jong was. They would not bother you. And I didn't believe them in the first place.
When did you? Were you still studying medicine?
Yeah, yeah.
Or how did you manage to do this?
Well, we had, after the Dutch students refused to sign a loyalty oath to Hitler, so the university was closed.
When was this?
1942. May 32, I think. I mean 42, May 42. And so that most of the students went full-time in underground work, me too. And we had classes. We had classes in my house and other houses. And we were invited at hospitals to serve as interns and to attend sections. So the medical schools were interested in keeping us informed, and we had exams. We did exams. The day of the liberation, it was after the peace treaty was signed in May 45, I was doing my tentamen in pathology, and a professor said to me, we're expecting the Canadian Army coming from the east.
As you were doing your examination?
Yeah, and he said, I hope you don't mind. My wife is going to be on the lookout and will warn us. They lived close to the Muiderstraat.
Which
the
is,
Muiderweg.
what's the significance of that?
Well, that's where they were coming from, the east, into Amsterdam. Through the Muiderpoort, I think, right? Well, it was the east of Amsterdam. It's not very clear in my mind. I think the Muiderstraat. Anyway, his wife called, knocked, and said, they're there. And we ran out. It was just a block. And we saw the tanks coming in, and everybody was waving little flags. And boy, that was a great sight.
At the time of your liberation, did you still have people hiding in your home?
Yeah, Wiesje van Santen was in our house still. And so was Bram, who had just come out of jail. And we said, it's stupid of you, Bram, to walk in the middle of the street. And what if some underling looking for Jews had caught you? Could I get you out again? And but he was very bold. Anyway, he said, I'm the only Jew who walked there without any papers from the jail to our house through the Leidse Straat.
Did he realize who had managed his release?
Yeah, he knew I had gone to Oostenfunten, sure. And then, those two were in our house. Hans de Jong was still staying with us. So those three at least. And then Jeanne and Truusje came out of jail, and they stayed with us. But of course, they were so-called non-Jews by now. Huh? So we had a house full, yeah.
Tina, of all the people that you and your mother helped, were there some that did not make it through the war?
Yeah, the De Leeuw, 3 of the De Leeuw children would not want to stay home, and they were caught in the street.
How old were they?
20, 19, and Suze De Leeuw was the only survivor of that family, and she had learned her lesson, and we said, don't go in the street. But I don't look so Jewish. Don't go in the street. You do, you know.
Anyone else who you had shielded that
That
didn't
got
make
caught.
it through?
Well, yeah, we heard sometimes so-and-so has been caught, and they had been in our house, you know. I don't think a week went by that you didn't hear somebody was caught, you know.
When the Canadian Army liberated you, how did your life change? What happened?
We danced in the street every day. There were draaiorgels, there were little bands everywhere. And if you walked there with a friend, you danced and then you went on again. It was great. We were still hungry.
What happened at home to you and your mother and the people who were hiding there?
Well, Hans de Jong went back to his factory in the east of Holland. It was Enschede, I think. And Jeanne and Truusje had this apartment that they were caught in. And they were, of course, happy not to be somebody's guests, you know, and be on their own. And Truusje got very involved in het Joodse Weeshuis with the refugees who came back out of the camp. She went to every train.
The Joodse Weeshuis was what?
Joodse Weeshuis, the Jewish orphanage. She had worked there to prepare herself for being a cook in the kibbutz. So she was a cook in the Jewish orphanage before the war.
No.
And she went there, and that was one of the homes for Jews when they came out of the camps. And there were some other places that would receive Jews, hospitals, of course. And she was very involved in that. And in 1945, she went to Marseille, and she waited for a boat, and she... She was so brave. I miss her.
What happened?
And then she had to go to all these wars in Israel. But she had a wonderful husband, 3 wonderful kids, and we visited with each other. And in 1992, I got this medal from Yad Vashem, and her husband, widowed by this time, showed me the house, the hut where Ben Gurion was retired. He was one of his watch guards when he was a young soldier. And he wrote a lot in Hebrew in the guest book. And he was crying all the time. And I said, "What are you writing?" He said, "I can't tell you. But you're in it." He said.
You must have found out in the meantime what he wrote.
Well,
some dedication.
he wrote some of these things that I'm telling you.
What happened to your friend? I didn't quite understand. She went to Marseille.
Marseille, and she got in one of these leaky boats and escaped and entered illegally into
So she was all
on
right.
the beach in Tel Aviv, and she worked in a kibbutz for many years, first as cook and then as a teacher, and she married a Sabra, Benzi Beri. He was in the Jewish contingent of the army, the Allied army, and then he fought in all the Jewish wars.
When the war ended and your house emptied out, what was your reaction?
Well, it didn't really empty out because Jane rented the upstairs from us, and she had a new boyfriend. She was widowed now, but she had a new boyfriend, and she moved in there with him. So my mother had this old friend again in the house.
And you, what did you do?
And she did fire the maid because the maid had blackmailed us. The maid stole from us. And she was in the black market, and she didn't do any cleaning anymore. And my mother would be scrubbing the bluestone steps down on the street, and these black marketeers would say, "Is Miss Lisa home?" And there was this smoke-filled room where she was doing black marketeering. But we profited from it too, you know. We got smoked eel and ham and bread and all those things that were not available. We would have been starved. I try to get out of this interview. I like to enjoy my life, you know. I don't have all that much years to live.
This is
And
tape
I
number
enjoy
5, by the
every
way.
day of my life. I do. I really enjoy my life. And in the war, we had fun too. We had parties, dances, and we would. There was a curfew, of course, from 8 to 6 in the morning, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. So if once you were there, you had to stay till 6, and we would sleep in what beds there were if we were tired. But we would play records and dance. And one time I remember I was on the Keizersgracht in a nice home of a friend of mine, and we were dancing. He was actually a dance teacher, so I loved going there. And all of a sudden, the bell rang. After curfew, bell rings, it's important, right? And it was a friend of his, he could see that, and the friend said, "You're going to have the Gestapo here within an hour. Get out." And all of a sudden, we were all sober as judges. We had been tipsy and dancing, and we were sober, and we got out immediately, out of the back. And I didn't know he was in the underground, but he was. So this is why I thought that everybody was, because unexpectedly, if you didn't know a dance teacher, he's in the underground, you know, I didn't think he was. He was sort of an airhead or something. Well, he was a solid citizen after the war, too.
Tina, what happened after the war was over? What did you do?
Well, I tried to get an internship and do all my exams, and I worked like the dickens to get ahead of the crowd that were waiting for internships. I knew they would be filled in no time, and then you could just wait, you know, wait and wait. So I did all my exams and everything I could to get through, and I did. I got my arts examen in 45, and then I did all these internships for 2 years, and I did my final in 47. Final exams in the different specialties.
Was there any recognition at that time of what you and your mother had done?
Nobody wanted to talk much about it, and we were happy to forget about it. I was happy to get out of the country, actually. You know, we were still ill-fed. For my husband and I were then finished, and we were drafted to either go to East Indies or West Indies, serve as doctors, or in the army. Well, my husband was very myopic, so he could go to the West Indies, and he enlisted as a doctor there, and I did too. And boy, the food you got there, oranges. We hadn't seen oranges for 7 years. We had no meat yet in 47. We had no eggs, only duck eggs, and they smelled like fish. So you could boil them. You had to boil them for over 10 minutes because they had typhoid, danger of typhoid. So you had to boil them, and so you put a lot of onions, and then I made an egg salad. They were not even easy to get.
Tina, I think we have skipped something somewhere.
Yeah.
You said your husband and you, and tell me, where did you meet him and where did you get
We were
married?
both medical students, so we had the same courses, and we met.
When did you meet him? What year?
Well, we saw each other all through the years, because he was interested in becoming a psychiatrist. So all the optional courses in psychiatry, we saw each other. There was a small group, relatively. And another friend of his, Van Danzig, I'm still friends with. He's a psychiatrist.
Was he involved? What was the name of your husband?
Strobos.
And his first name?
Robert Strobos.
Was he in the resistance movement too?
No, he was very myopic. And I think he was actually living with the Forings, who was head of the SDAP, Koos Forink. He was engaged to Puk Forink, Irene Forink. And that broke up, and then we got together in 45. And the Forinks did a lot in the war, and he lived with them, but he wasn't very active. Partly because of his myopia, and partly I think he was afraid.
And when did you get married?
We got married in 46, April 46. And in 47 we went to Aruba, West Indies. We were there for 2 years, and my son Simon was born there.
Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, it was
Were you
like
practicing?
a paradise in a way,
Were you practicing then?
Yeah.
I see. Then what happened after the 2 years in
Then
Aruba?
we went to the United States, and we had some friends here, and we tried to get a residency here. And I was able to get a residency, both of us, in neurology. We felt that it was better to do neurology first. That was required in Holland, not here. But we felt that it was a good idea because psychiatry, you have to know more about people's detailed background, If they live in the Bronx or they come from Puerto Rico or whatever. So we both got that, and then he got a fellowship at Columbia University. So then my son Jur was born in 52. We still thought we were going back, but then he was offered a very sort of assistant professorship, and we decided to stay. And I did my residencies in psychiatry in Valhalla 1 year. It's now New York Medical College, and Cornell, White Plains, and Bowman Gray Medical School in Winston-Salem. And I worked in child guidance, and I became director of a child guidance clinic there. And then when we came back in 60 here, my husband was full professor in neurology. He had switched. And I became staff member of the New Rochelle Guidance Center 3 days a week. And then I started a school for emotionally disturbed children under the aegis of the New Rochelle Guidance Center. It still exists.
Tina, at some point, the war must have come back
Yeah.
into your life.
I became involved in helping blacks here, in tutoring in Harlem, painting in Harlem. And the organization was called, we had a truck with paints and all that, and the truck was called I Give a Damn. And then in the 80s I became involved in the women's movement, now, and my friend and I started a committee on women, for the health of women and discrimination against women. And there were 3 of those organizations. I became president of American Medical Women's Association, Branch 32, Westchester. One time we had 700 members. And we tried to help the young women medical students on how to combine family and being doctor.
Specifically
because
for
it
medical
was a
students.
new thing, because the older doctors had usually given up being a family or a mother for being doctors. That was the fashion in the 20s and 30s, that you couldn't combine it. And we, as our example, had combined it, all the 10 members of the committee. And so we had a committee in the AMA and in the American Psychiatric Association. Not that our colleagues accepted us, but we held well-attended conferences on rape, on domestic violence, on health care for women, daycare, on breast cancer and how it was treated in a discriminating way, on imagine, for 70 years they never changed that operation, total mastectomy. And that is totally different, thanks to women doctors and the committees on women who pressured them to change that. I myself had a lumpectomy 5 years ago with radiation. So I'm glad I have my breast still, even though I'm an old lady.
Tina, is what you're doing or what you have done now somehow another a continuation of what you did during the war in Holland?
I think so. I think so. Having a social conscience, caring about other people than myself and my little family. And in the 80s, a man, Oliner, a sociologist, had been a hidden child, and he started doing a study on altruism. He wanted to find out, like you do, why do people sacrifice or risk their life for other people? And so he came to me, he had heard about me, and then that was the first study that was done about me. And I'm in that book of the altruistic personality. And then Malka Drucker and Gay Block wrote the book, The Rescuers. And they had life-size photographs of the rescuers, an exhibit of about 70 rescuers that has gone through all the musea of the country. And I often appeared to speak on the experience. I was asked to speak. I've also been asked in many synagogues to talk about what I did. And it was a great consolation for people to hear that there were people who not just let it happen, but did something. I think about 120,000 Jews were hidden in Holland, but only about 15,000 survived. I might be exaggerating the numbers, but certainly 20,000 were hidden, but were still, so many were caught.
Are you happy about the fact that the Holocaust has become a big field of study and interest?
Yes, of course. It was a very, very important, one of the most crucial, important events of history. On the other hand, when I think of all the effort and time that you and I are now spending on the cameraman and the Spielberg thing, spending on repeating what really I've told already, I feel kind of that I should put my energy in discrimination today that's still happening. And I don't have quite the energy to go to Harlem and paint. I don't have quite the energy to tutor little kids, you know. I'm still working, I still practice, and I feel I'm doing some good with that. And I don't only have rich patients. Some patients pay me very little, but I feel good about that. Then I have a very sick husband, as you just found out. He had another heart attack just this morning. They keep him overnight, I hear you. They'll keep him. I'll visit him after this.
Looking back over, let's say, the war years, is that something that is that something that you would rather not get bothered with too much at this point?
Yeah. As you can see, I'm still overcome with grief over it. And it's not as bad as it used to be when I had nightmares about being arrested and running and escaping, you know. I don't have those nightmares anymore about that. And I think it has been somewhat of a relief, and it's of course an honor to be recognized. I'm very proud of being recognized at Yad Vashem and have a medal. That I'm very proud of. But for instance, if I speak in a synagogue, it sounds crazy, but they give me these big slabs, and they look like gravestones to me. And it says, you know, thank you, Dr. Strobos, etc. And I said, please don't give me anything when I speak to you. I have enough honors, thank you very much. And when I spoke for, JCC, I said, I hope you don't find it arrogant, but I know that you give things to speakers. Please don't give me a big marble slab. I'm moving, I can't take it with me. He said, I was just ordering it for you. And I said, please don't. Well, we want to give you something. What do you want? I said, how about a pen with a name of each of your organization? So he gave me a little alarm clock with my name. Oh, that is nice, I think, you know.
Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel you want to say?
Well, I can say that I was proud to be recognized. And I'm glad that the Holocaust is not a forgotten history like so many people would have liked it to be, and that it can't be denied anymore. When I went to the opening of the Holocaust Museum on the Mall in Washington, there were 10,000 survivors and rescuers, and the Warsaw Ghetto fighters were invited. And one of them was sitting next to us, and it was raining, and it was 30 degrees. It was so cold, and we were shivering. It was raining. Were you there? And we had umbrellas, you know. And, of course, then you don't see very much anymore on this big screen, and the president speaking, and the rabbin was speaking, Elie Wiesel. But when I got out of the taxi with my husband, there was a bunch of skinheads with big horns talking, you know. It's all a museum full of lies. And Clinton said, we have to be on guard. You hear these people. We have to be on guard. We have to remember and be on guard. Those people exist here too, the hate people. And that was a good experience. Well, anyway, this Warsaw Ghetto fighter was sitting next to us. He didn't speak much English. And he'd never put up his umbrella. And I said to Walter, he has an umbrella, but he isn't putting it up. It's raining. He said, he's saving it for a rainy day. I thought that was great. So I try to get a fun out of something, you know. And when we had these hiders in our house, we often laughed. would you believe it that we listened to the radio and we would invite everybody who was hiding in the neighborhood, and we would have 30 Jews hiding in the neighborhood to come to listen to Churchill or the Queen. And my mother said, the Dutch anthem, quiet everybody. The Queen is going to speak. Well, the Queen had just finished, and my mother was so tired from looking after all these people, she had fallen asleep. And she woke up with the Dutch anthem, and we laughed and laughed. Can you imagine 30 people had just heard the Queen and my mother shutting them up? And then one time, I used these Bols bottles,
With what?
A bottle for Bols. These.
What's in those?
Yeah. Well, I put hot water in them so I could study in my room, and I would study in my bed with a fur coat on and this bottle on my feet under the blanket so I could study. And then I came in the room where we all lived, where we had this one little stove, and it was made out of a 2-pound can of Maxwell coffee, and that was our stove. Anyway, I saw my bottle, and I would empty it out and put hot water in it. And as I was emptying it out, I smelled gin. My mother and the hiders had bought a bottle of gin. And Leon Nordheim, whose name I mentioned, came in and saw what happened. He saw me standing there, and he smelled it too, and he started laughing. Everyone running. What happened? What happened? She just threw out the gin, $60. And I'm laughing, and my mother came in. She said, "Didn't you see those little glasses standing there?" No, I didn't see those little glasses standing there. So maybe it's silly to laugh about it, but everybody who heard it thought it was a funny story.
Tina, I forgot to ask you, what happened with your mother?
My mother never was honored or recognized. Never. She died in 1973, before this big revival of the Holocaust
Where did
started.
she die?
She died in Amsterdam. She came to visit me every spring and every fall. She couldn't stand the heat and the cold here. And she thought this climate was just horrid. And so she would come 6 weeks, in the spring, and 8 weeks. And I would visit her, in the summer. And she was happy there. She had all her friends and relatives, very close-knit family.
Why was she not honored at Yad Vashem?
Nobody knew about it then. It took Bram Pijs all these years to talk about it too, and write his autobiography. He proposed me.
I was going to
But
ask
my
you.
mother was dead by that time. My mother is on the stone in Yad Vashem, and on my medal. Yeah, I have another medal where her name is on. But my grandmother was never recognized. And if you don't mind hearsay, I just talked to my cousin Henk, who also was in jail for helping Jews. And I visited him in Leiden last October. And he said he was in the army in World War II, and then he was drafted to work in Germany in the war by the Germans.
Excuse me, Tina, which army was he in?
He was in the Dutch army during the World War II. Then he was released, but then he was drafted to work in Germany. All the soldiers were. And he didn't want to go. He didn't trust them. And he got false papers, and he hid in my grandmother's house. And then one time they heard a lot of commotion and screaming and crying, looked out the window, and there was a raid in the street. Barbed wire closing off the streets, machine guns, and they went house to house searching for Jews. And there were people thrown on cars, trucks. And the bell rang. And there was Suze de Leeuw, whom you've heard before. She wasn't hiding then yet, but the soldiers were hiding. And she came in and she said, "Can I hide in your house? They're raiding our street." And that's where she lived. And my grandmother said yes. No pause, yes. She didn't ask if she had papers. And Hank was telling me this story. He said, that was the kind of grandmother we had. I said, but Hank, you were in danger too. You didn't say, do you have papers? I'm in danger too. You said yes too. He said, yeah, I did.
It also came as sort of natural, you think,
Yeah.
within your family. Yeah.
It didn't occur to him that he could have said no. It didn't occur to him. Didn't occur to me ever. And my mother said once to me, you know, a lot of these people wouldn't have done that for us. I said, yes, I know. Especially so and so and so and so. Selfish people. Of course. She said, well, Jews are no different from other people. The selfish ones, and your friends are good people.
Do you feel that after the war was over that many people or some did not keep contact with you? And
Well, the Sieg Pekel and Suze de Leeuw regarded my mother as their mother almost, and they kept very close contact. And I visited her once a week or something like that when she got older. And she was in a home then, and she loved it there. She was happy there, and it was not like the homes here. You know, it was different. Anyway, she got very wonderful care. She had a little kitchen, she had a bedroom and a living room, and then they had a child. The child grew up as a no-goodnik, maybe having an awful father. I don't know why. He was spoiled rotten, of course, on one hand, because he was the only survivor of the Leeuw family. And they had a store. They started a store of her father, which was in porcelain and glass goods. And Sieg Pekel was a good businessman, and the store thrived in Amsterdam. My mother visited there often. But this kid said, my grandfather was a very rich man. Marie Schotte must have stolen his money. It is true that they gave some money to my mother and some aandelen to sell, because their 3 children were in our house, right? And whether there was anything more left or less left, my mother wouldn't be a bookkeeper about that kind of thing, you know? That was not her thing anyway. And they weren't rich. They made good money, but they were spenders. As soon as they had money, they spent it.
wait a minute, I've lost track.
The Leeuw family,
The Leeuw family.
where she went, you know, through the ghetto to look if there was anybody left. And she rescued Suze and her husband. And then this kid started bad-mouthing my mother, and she didn't want anything to do with them anymore. She said, how can you believe this? And Sieg Pekel, whom we never loved, kept his mouth shut. And Suze, being a rather weak person, under the thumb of her husband, felt impotent to do anything about it. I went to their store one time, and Suze hugged me and cried, you know. And I said, how can you do this to my mother? She said, it's my son and my husband doing this. I said, can't you just go visit my mother? She said, she doesn't want to see me. I called her. She's very angry at us.
What are your feelings about all that at this point?
Some people are very grateful. Wiesje van Santen said, for 30 years I didn't want to talk to you. I didn't want to hear the doctors. I put her in the hospital for an operation, all clandestine. Can you imagine how difficult all that was? And she said, if I see one of the doctors who operated me, I quickly go in a side street. And I didn't want to talk to you, but please come now and visit me. And you saved my life. your mother and you were so wonderful. So after 30 years, she wanted to, my husband and I, my mother was dead by that time, my husband and I went to see her, and she wrote me a little note, "You saved my life again." Because I said, "Wiesje, what you have is a gallstone trouble or a gallstone infection. Go to your doctor and have it examined." And it was true. And she was on antibiotics and it healed. She was always throwing up. And she thought it was from the war experience, you know? Yeah. Anyway. And then we once went again, and her two maids screamed at Walter and me all the time. They went out on a trip, and then her two daughters came, very plechte, very official sounding, and said, "We don't want you to stay here. That's not good for her mother. She's not in good health."
What country was this?
Wiesje van Zanten had a big house on the Keizersgracht. She married a very wealthy man, and her two daughters, now grown women with families of their own, came to Walter and me in 1980 or something and said, "You can't stay with my mother because she's a very sick woman." So I didn't feel too good about staying there with the maids screaming at me and the daughters not wanting me there. I actually burst out in tears. Now I'm laughing about it. It's so crazy, isn't it? And Wiesje wanted me there.
Tina, I think we're coming to the end of this interview. I would like to ask you, is there any grand statement or philosophy that you would like to add on to this interview about your experiences?
I guess there is. I think that we could further civilization and train people and teach people, young people, to have more compassion for other people, to have more courage, to stand up for their opinions. And this is why I do speak, even though it's sometimes preaching to the converted. But I would like to strengthen those people in their belief in their own goodness and that it does make a difference, and not be a bystander when something bad happens, and to stand up. And I'm proud of people who go to Kosovo to help, or Rwanda, and I think we should do more of that. And I do think that civilization does make some progress, like a law against child labor, a law against child abuse. That wasn't there. A father could beat a child to death and nobody said, well, it's a family affair. Or he could rape, and rape was a joke when I was young. It was called a thing that women engendered by their loose clothing or whatever. And I've had patients who were 70 years old who were raped in their house by some crazy burglar. And this woman said to me, "And I never liked sex, you know." So, I mean, that's irrelevant. We have to teach about those things, and that's what my life has been about. And I want to teach people, and I do believe that it's teachable to stand up. How do you gain courage? Well, I told you about the stories of my grandmother. I learned courage from her and my mother, standing up and being arrested against the Nazi films. And I was proud of her that she never objected. She knew what she was doing. And I'm very proud of her. And my whole family was involved and in jail, and many of my friends. And one of my very dearest friends has come back from a camp. He was not Jewish. Come back from a camp more dead than alive. And I'm glad he did what he did, work for Underground Paper. And I just visited him in May. He's a psychiatrist, Dries van Danzig, and he's still doing good works. He's trying to get parity for mental illness as to physical illness, so that there will be equal pay for one illness is just like another. The discrimination against mentally ill is a terrible discrimination. So there's lots to do still, and I'll keep on doing it till I die.
Thank you.
This is a picture of the Schotte family. That is my grandparents, Willem Schotte and Marie Schotte. And from left to right, there is Willem Jr., my uncle. On the front row, Willem. And then Evert Schotte, Jur Schotte. I'm sorry, start over again. I'll start with the back row. Standing in the back row is Jacob Schotte, the oldest son of Willem and Marie, and the oldest daughter, Jans. Then from left to right on the second row is Willem Jr. Schotte, then Jur Schotte, my mother's closest brother, and then Evert Schotte, the little one. I'm sorry, I've skipped my grandfather, Willem Schotte. So from left to right, the second row is Willem Jr., Jur Schotte, Willem Sr., Evert Schotte, Marie Schotte. Standing up in the back is Alida Schotte, and the last on the right is my mother, Marie Schotte. This was about 1905. They were not so poor anymore, as you can see, and it was in the Jordaan in Amsterdam, Holland. And involved in the helping of Jews was Jacob Schotte, standing in first one left, Jans, standing up in the back. Alida died young in 1940. My grandmother, Marie Schotte, hid Jews, and my mother, the one on the right, who's about 11, 12 there. This is a portrait of Marie Schotte Jr., my mother, at the age of 18.
Where was it taken, do you think?
Taken in Amsterdam, probably.
What year?
I suppose it was, she was born in 1893, and so it was 1910. From left to right is Marie Schotte, my mother, then called Marie Buchter Schotte. They hyphenated in Holland. And Tineke Buchter, age 8, 1928. My father, Alphonse Buchter, in 1928.
Any idea where this was done?
Was taken on the Veluwe in Holland. Remember, we went to look at the whatever.
Okay.
This is a photo of the party my mother gave in June 41 for Bram Pijs, who was the last Jew allowed to get his PhD. Universities in Holland were closed because we refused to sign a loyalty oath to Hitler. Pijs is the father of nuclear particles. At this party, you see from left to right his mother, who was a hidden Jew in Hillegom and survived the war. Behind her, standing, is Jaap van Amerongen's wife. She fled with her husband, who's standing or sitting in front of her. Jaap van Amerongen. They survived the war with false papers, working as Gentiles in Limburg. He later became budget director of the Israeli government. Between Mrs. Pijs and Jaap van Amerongen is a professor's wife. I forgot her name. Then next comes Tineke Strobos, then Buchter, and behind her is standing Bram Pijs's father, who was hidden in a farm during the war and survived the war. The end of the table is Dr. Pijs, who became a famous nuclear physicist. Next to him is his best friend, Leon Nordheim, who was shot, caught and shot in the war. In front of him, seated, is Jeanne van Amerongen, his wife, my best friend, Tirza van Amerongen, next my mother, smiling, and a professor, forgot his name. Standing next to Leon Nordheim is Bram Pijs's sister Annie and her husband Herman de Leeuw. They both chose to go to Germany when they were drafted. They thought they would survive the war working in a factory. I tried to convince them to go into hiding. They absolutely refused. Next to Herman de Leeuw is Lea Giete, now married to Sig Giete, standing next to her. I brought them to the Belgian border in the war, and they escaped walking through Belgium, France, Spain, where she had a baby. Took them 7 months. They are now living in Israel. Sig Giete became director of the hospital in Tel Aviv. They have several children. Okay. This is the house on the Nieuwe Zijds Voorburgwal 282, behind the palace of Amsterdam, where we hid the Jews, where my mother and I lived, and I was born in that house. The hiding place was made in the attic, period. This is Tine Strobos, born Buchter, Tineke Buchter, a portrait made by a Jewish portrait painter in the war who was in hiding and who was looking for a reliable model so that he could practice his art. And I volunteered. I think you can see something of the turmoil of those times.
Do you know his name, Tina?
No, I never knew his name. He didn't tell me his name. And I guess I could find out if I go to an art dealer or, could find. I know one of those Jewish portrait painters. You're not doing this, right?
Well, I was.
Yeah, one of the Jewish portrait painters was Monnikendam. But that's not him, because I know him.
Monnikendam isn't a Jewish name.
This was a happy time. There's Tineke Buchter and Bram Pijs at the day of his doctoral thesis. And it was a happy memory. It was June 1941 on the roof of the house up the Voorburgwal where we hid all these people later on. No, not yet married, but engaged to This is Tineke Strobos Buchter. Medical student still, shortly after the war. This is a certificate I received from Yad Vashem, and I'm glad that my mother is mentioned on it. Dr. Tine Strobos and Marie Buchter Schotte, with 2 T's. And I received that in, I thought it was 90, in 90. That's what I was there.
Where did you get this?
No, actually this is sent to me. I didn't go until 2 years later, yeah. Then I got another medal when I went. I have 2 medals. One that they sent to me, and then when I came they gave me another one. I said to the director, Paul Deal, I'm not on. Back row, Tom Fairlam, Alan Fairlam, his father, Simon Strobos, my oldest son, Walter Judson, standing up, second row, left to right, Zoe Fairlam,
Tina.
Caroline Strobos, Tine Strobos, Caroline Battenburg Strobos, my daughter-in-law, and her daughter Rafaela Strobos, and Reinier Strobos.
Again, right?
Go. Back row, Tom Fairlam, grandson, his father, Alan Fairlam, my son-in-law. Behind me, Simon Strobos, my oldest son. Standing up, Walter Judson, my husband. Second row, Carolyn Strobos Fairlam, my daughter. Her daughter, Zoe Fairlam.
Is that the one on her lap?
On her lap is Zoe Tine Strobos Fairlam, is her full name. Then comes Tine Strobos. Then my daughter-in-law, Caroline Battenburg. And on her lap is Rafaela Strobos, my granddaughter, and her son, Reinier Marcel Strobos.
Also a grandson.
Yeah, grandson, sorry.